Good evening, ladies and gentlemen and speakers, and thank you all very much for coming along tonight to this, our second big gathering session. And tonight it's all about euthanasia is not healthcare. So we are very lucky to have four wonderful speakers, some on island, some who have come in, and there will be a Q&A session afterwards. So take note, and we will then have seats full and people will be able to answer all of your questions. My name's William Church and I'm emceeing it this evening. So what I thought I'd do is just give you a literal rerun, a bit of the history as to how we've got to where we are and what's happening right now. So in 2019, there was a petition to the States Assembly, and out of that, the Health Minister put together there was a call to put together a citizens' jury. So the 23 Jersey residents were selected supposedly at random to have a look into all of this. But I think one of the things which we have articulated, that 80% of those people were in favour of a change in the law at the time. So we were slightly up against it. Anyway, the result from that was that in November 2021, going back in time, in 2021, November 2021, there was a vote taken by the last state sitting, and they agreed in principle that they would change the law to allow assisted suicide and euthanasia. Euthanasia, that's a very important part as well, because originally it was talking about assisted suicide, and it was only at the 11th hour that they added in the bit about euthanasia. And that's actually quite a critical point, because the two methods used in assisted dying vary enormously. And effectively with euthanasia, you are handing over the responsibility to somebody else. And so it's a lot easier in some respects rather than having to administer it to yourself. So the draft proposal was released after the first public consultation in early 22, and there was a second public consultation, during which time there was a far better response from the public. Now, since I've been involved in it, I've had many a conversation with John. I think that not only the people here, you're maybe a lot more engaged than other members of the population in Jersey, but I think that we were actually all a little bit slow and sleepy to realise what was going on and the extent of the debate that was going to be out there, and the fact there was the potential of changing a law, which is massive. But when it got round to the second public consultation, there was a much, much better response from the public. And it was very much about, what this proposal to change the law and what it would entail. Out of the back of that, it then triggered an ethics review. This has actually been released only this week. It's 85 pages. It's available through the government website. I haven't read it all. There are some people here who will be part of the panel later on who have read it, and it raises a lot of questions. And so if you've got questions about that, then please feel free to ask. But tonight we are joined, we've got a couple of Canadian speakers, and the reason that we've got that, and we had, as you may remember from when we did an event earlier on in the year when Leonie Hertz came over from Canada, the reason we focused on Canada is because the proposals, they do very closely mirror a lot of what is going on in Canada right now. And therefore, I think it's fascinating and very important that we bring people in and we can draw on their experiences and how things have changed since the law was changed in Canada. So bear that in mind as well. And please, when you're asking questions, it'll all come through. I've got a magical bit of kit here, which I'll be picking it up. But ask as detailed, and there's no such thing as a daft question, and we really do encourage you to get involved and to ask whatever questions you'd like to ask. So moving on, I'm going to be calling up, but I'll do a little quick introduction to our first speaker, and I would say perhaps our main speaker of the evening, which is Alex Schadenberg, who's the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and he's been that since July 1999. He's also chairperson for EPC International since November 2007. He has authored numerous articles that have been published in papers worldwide. So he really is an expert on this topic. Has co-produced some, like the Fatal Fours film and the Euthanasia section documentary, and also the film Turning the Tide. He's published books, so very, very well read, and it's my delight to be able to welcome Alex to the stage now.
It's good to see such a good group out, and I've only got a little bit of time to share with you, so if there's anything, maybe we'll take, I'm looking forward to the questions at the end too, is what I'm saying. So we should move on, because we've got a lot to cover in a very short period of time. We don't want to be here all night. Okay, so why do we oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide? Well, it's the very basic reason starts with the fact that this is an act of killing. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I'm opposed to killing people. Euthanasia is an act of killing. If you were to question that, well, you look at the Canadian law in Canada. How we legalize euthanasia in Canada was by creating an exception in the criminal code to homicide. So obviously, that's what we've done. Assisted suicide is a little different than euthanasia, but it's the same intention and the same outcome. So with euthanasia, the doctor actually does the act of causing your death, right? In the case of assisted suicide, the doctor would be providing you, or a nurse practitioner in Canada would be providing you the lethal means, and you have to take that yourself. You have to do it yourself. So one is assisting a suicide, and one would be a form of homicide, no matter how you want to look at it. The law in Canada, for instance, gives physicians and nurses, literally it gives them the right in law to cause your death. That's how it works. We move on. So Canada first passed euthanasia law, and it was euthanasia and assisted suicide, but it's almost all been euthanasia. There's been very few assisted suicides. It's an important thing to say that, because it's not like Oregon or the U.S. jurisdictions where it's mainly assisted suicide. Nonetheless, we passed that in 2016, and the original law said that you had to have your natural death being reasonably foreseeable. So that was a type of a terminal illness restriction. And then in March of 2021, we passed Bill C-7, which then expanded the law. And this is a very important point, because, what I'm going to tell you with all these stories in a few minutes, I would not have imagined would be the case in 2016 when we legalized euthanasia. But we very quickly expanded the law, and we got rid of that terminal illness requirement. We created what you call a two-track law. The law allows you, if you are considered to be terminally ill, you can have a same-day death. I'm not saying everyone's having a same-day death. I'm saying it's certainly possible by the law. There's no waiting period at all. And if you're not considered terminally ill, you have a 90-day waiting period. And we also expanded euthanasia to people who had been approved before but had become incompetent. So that was also in Bill C-7. So what that meant is if you had been approved for death, and then let's say you had a stroke before they actually had done the act, therefore in the original law you had to be competent at the time of death, so they took that out, that they could still cause your death even though you have become incompetent. And they also added euthanasia for mental illness alone. Originally they had a 2-year moratorium on that, so that would have started in March of this year, but then they added an extra year of a moratorium onto it till March of 2024. So as of this moment in Canada, euthanasia for mental illness alone will be beginning in March 17th of 2024. It's very important because I'm talking about mental illness alone, right? That's what I'm talking about. Essentially, a person is required to have an irremediable medical condition. So how did that come about? Is because originally you had to have a terminal condition, but you also had to have an irremediable medical condition. It's actually my film producer, but anyway. I'm working on a film right now. I'm actually working on a film right now on euthanasia for mental illness. We've done a lot of amazing interviews. But anyway, and so, and I should have turned off that, sorry. But when you remove that terminal illness requirement, then what are you left with? Now, there's other things part of the law too, such as you have to be suffering. But here's the problem with these restrictions around suffering. If you tell me you're suffering, I can't tell you you're not. I'm not in your body, I'm not in your mind. So therefore, there's nothing, you can't assess it in any way. But an irremediable medical condition, what it means is someone would have to have a chronic condition or possibly a terminal condition. So we move on. And the 22 data just recently came out of Canada. We had 13,241 reported assisted deaths. Almost all of them were euthanasia. That was up from 10,092 in 2021, which was a 31% increase. And you'll notice the data is essentially about a 30% increase every year, okay? This is far beyond what anybody had predicted would happen. And the data showed that 3.5% of these deaths were not terminally ill people in 2022. But actually, that's not an accurate number. And I'm not going to go into that. You can ask me in the question period why that's not accurate. In 2022, Quebec had 6.6% of all deaths were euthanasia. That put them as the highest in the world. British Columbia was second highest at 5.5%. This is significant because the Netherlands legalized euthanasia in 2002. So that means in 20 years, the Netherlands are now at 5.1% of all deaths, which is significant. There's anything good about that. But I mean, in Quebec, in a short 7-year period, they are at 6.6% and only going up. We move on. Some cases. Well, you know, in February 2022, there was a case reported in the media about a 51-year-old woman who had multiple chemical sensitivities, MCS, and she died by euthanasia. Now, the other side would tell you that this woman, she wanted to die by euthanasia. She actually had requested it. She even thanked the doctor before she died. And so, you know, what's our concern about this? The question is, why did a woman with MCS get approved for euthanasia? MCS, multiple chemical sensitivities, means that she was reacting to certain chemicals in the environment around her, and she was, you know, breaking out. It was impossible for her to work. The problem in this case is this woman was living in social housing. She was living in social housing. You have to think this one out. If you had MCS, living in a big social housing apartment unit wouldn't do well for you because you'd be reacting to your neighbors, things they're using. She was reacting also to the different cigarette smoke and also pot and the cleaning fluids. She was reacting to all these things. She said she couldn't leave her bedroom. That's how she described her life. So this is concerning, but what she needed was a clean place to live. That's what she needed. She died in February of 2022, and then soon after, this next story hit the media of the 31-year-old with multiple chemical sensitivities. Now, what's significant about that case is that she got approved for euthanasia, but she found out about the concept of possibly dying by euthanasia because the first one hit the media that she actually did die, right? In her case, she's living today because people raised money and helped her to find a clean place to live. The question is, why were these ladies approved for death? They're not terminally ill, and they have a treatable condition, which means a clean place to live. We move on. In July of 2019, Alan Nichols was brought by the police to the Chilliwack Hospital because he was deeply depressed and suicidal. So they brought him there to protect himself. He was brought there for mental health concerns. Now, this was not a new situation for Alan. Alan, for most of his life, had gone through a lot of depression. He would go deep in, and then he'd get better again. He'd be fine, right? So what happened is 3 days before he died, his family was informed that he was going to be dying by euthanasia. He was not sick. He had no medical conditions, but he was deeply depressed. The family begged the doctors to change their mind and to reassess him, but instead they said he's been approved, and how the law works, if you're approved by one doctor and you're signed off by a second, you're good to go. So they ended up killing him. The problem here, of course, is the fact that Alan had been going through these deep depression situations all of his life. So this was not the first time he had been in a mental health institution for his own care. But this time, they had taken his request to die as a request for medical aid in dying, and he died. There's a lot more to this case. We'll move on. In February of 2020, Donna Duncan, now you have to look at that timing. February 25th was just before we had the whole thing of COVID-19 restrictions begin, okay? But in February 25th of 2020, Donna Duncan got into a car accident, and she was diagnosed with this. She had quite a significant concussion. Now, the problem here was due to the COVID-19 restrictions, she was not receiving the treatment she needed. And, you know, I don't know how things were here in Jersey, but in Canada, they really restricted care and treatment based on the fact that they were concerned about the spreading effect of COVID. And so she was not receiving treatment. On October 29, 2021, she died by euthanasia, medical aid in dying. The family, the daughters here in the picture, were just distraught. They could not believe that their mother was, first of all, approved, and they could not believe that their mother had died. And they asked the police for an investigation. And they've been still, like, they're still distraught about this, as they have brought themselves before all these parliamentary committees, et cetera, to speak about it. But the fact of it is that this shows you the reality that because they approved their mother, she died. In fact, there was no intervention from the family in this case whatsoever. It was a very sad, distraught situation for them. And the reality was she needed treatment, not death. We move on. I'm not saying death is a good reason for anything, actually, in my case. But, I mean, in her case, she definitely needed treatment. The case of the 23-year-old in Ontario was very interesting. He was approved for euthanasia at the MAID clinic in the Euthanasia clinic in Toronto, and he had diabetes. Now, his case was very interesting because what happened to him is during the COVID time, he became very depressed and he stopped taking insulin, and he was insulin dependent. And it didn't work out very well for him. He became quite sick. But this situation was actually post-COVID. He was actually stable, but he was wanting to die, and he was approved for euthanasia. His mother was shocked by the fact that her 23-year-old son, who was not dying, not terminally ill, in fact, he was stable at this point, was approved for euthanasia. So she made a big deal about it. And she ended up contacting, in a big way, the Ministry of Health and all the media. And she made such a big deal about it that the doctor who had agreed to do the euthanasia death decided not to do it. So he's alive today, because I think that the reason no other doctor has agreed to do that death was because they're afraid of his mother. I think it's true, actually. There's the case of Amir Farsu. Amir is a guy from St. Catharines, Ontario, and he was living so we have what you call rent controls in Ontario. And so he's a man with a disability who was living in a low rental apartment, and the building was bought and was being repaired, and he was told he had to leave. But he was in a situation where he tried to find another place to rent, and he couldn't afford anywhere. Now, if you consider the situation in southern Ontario near Toronto, because he's near Toronto, he's in St. Catharines, you can understand that if you're on a disability payment, a disability benefit, you can't afford rent. If you have a special rental unit, yes, you can, but if not, you can't. He could not find a place to live, so he applied for euthanasia. He was approved for euthanasia based on his disability, but the reason he was asking for it is he said, I would rather be dead than homeless. A GoFundMe campaign raised quite a bit of money for him, and he has a place to live. We move on. Veterans Affairs. You know, this shows you the normalization of killing in our country. So you have a man who had served our country, Canadian country, in Afghanistan, who now is experiencing significant PTSD. So he contacts the Veterans Affairs Office because he's seeking help for his treatment. And they tell him that he should be considering medical aid in dying. Now that might seem shocking to you, but what happened is the Veterans Affairs Minister, his name is Lawrence McCauley, in the government, he announced that this was just a rogue case. This was the one bad situation that should have never happened. It was, a Veterans Affairs worker that just said something he shouldn't have said. And he thought, I think Lawrence McCauley thought it was done, other than the fact is as soon as you start announcing something to the media, then everybody hears it, and of course all these other cases started coming up. We now know that there was at minimally 6 cases. We know minimally 2 people died by euthanasia. And then it started to settle down, and then they were having a bit of a hearing about this problem in Veterans Affairs, and Christine Gauthier made a presentation to them. And so she's a woman who had served our country. She became disabled while serving our country. After that, she became a Paralympian, and so you see her here with her dog and her wheelchair. She was a Paralympic athlete who did very well. She was asking Veterans Affairs for a wheelchair lift. Not exactly an unrealistic request. So she served our country, she became disabled. Now she's asking for help to put a wheelchair lift in her home. And she was told by the Veterans Affairs worker, Madam, if you're really so desperate, we can give you medical assistance in dying. Now this shows you the normalization. This shows you a real problem that someone actually would have the audacity to say that, especially to someone who served our country. We move on. This is a more recent case. So in June, Catherine Mentler, she was experiencing suicidal ideation. She was really, she had gone through this before. So if you read her story, you realize she's saying, I've had mental health issues for many years. I've gone through a lot of mental health difficulties. So she says in the articles and in her interviews, She had the wit about her that she knew she needed help. She went to the Vancouver General Hospital for help, and the counselor told her that there was no psychiatrist that she could see until November at the earliest. So that shows you our waiting lists for care in British Columbia, because this was June, and she was told November you could see a psychiatrist. And she was also told, well, there's no beds available for her, so we can't let you come in, so that's not an option. And so then the counselor said to her, have you thought about medical assistance in dying? This is actually very crass if you think the fact that she's actually gone to the hospital because she doesn't want to die. She's trying to seek help because she's feeling suicidal, right? And this has not been a new situation for her, so she's understanding this. This shows you the nature of the issue when it's so normalized that it was actually brought up. There's actually more to the story. Someone asked me a question later. I'm happy to talk about it. We move on. Well, the case of Joan Roway, you couldn't actually make these stories up. If I had made this story up, you would think, oh, Alex, that's just too far. Now you're really pushing it. No, this was a story that showed up in a BC newspaper. Joan had cancer, and she's subsequently passed away, but she was in a situation where she and her oncologist were talking, and her oncologist explained that there was nothing more they could do for her, which is, that's a normal situation. She was approaching death. She was living with her daughter and her son-in-law. You see their picture there. She's living in their home. They're caring for her as she's dying. But during that conversation with the oncologist, the issue of medical aid in dying came up, and the oncologist had approved her for euthanasia, even though she says she never asked for it. She said she never requested it, but she is terminally ill, so I guess she was an easy approval. All the boxes fit, they were all ticked off, and there must have been a second physician asked to sign off, and a second one must have signed off, because that's how the law works. So what happened is the family gets a phone call from Fraser Health, which is their health regional control, saying, we're coming to pick up your mother, Joan, because her May death has been scheduled. Well, there's no May death that Joan is looking for, okay? So they sent 2 people over to the house to pick up Joan. The family refused to let them in the house. You can check this news story because, you would think I'm pulling your leg, but it's true. So finally, then soon after, the BC Health Authority was smart enough to send over a representative who was actually a bit more conciliatory and asked Joan if she wanted medical aid in dying, and Joan said no. But you got to think about this, someone coming to your house to take your mother. It's pretty scary. We move on. Euthanasia for mental illness. Well, I already told you that's going to be starting in Canada now as of March of 2024. And there's a serious issue here. Now, I quote Dr. Sonia Game because he is a very important psychiatrist in Canada. He teaches at the University of Toronto. He's a past president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. He's not opposed to euthanasia, medical aid in dying. In fact, when the law was passed in Canada, he was, for a period of time, the head of their committee at the hospital at Sunnybrook. So he was not opposed to the concept. He's opposed to the concept of euthanasia for mental illness. Anyway, he makes it very clear that you cannot have euthanasia for mental illness because you cannot predict that these conditions are irremediable. Irremediable means there's nothing more we can do for you, right? And as he says, I cannot predict which of my patients will get better and which ones won't. Some of them might never get better. That's correct, right? We know that. Some people have very difficult psychiatric conditions. But he says, I can't predict it as a professional. It's impossible for me to know. The Council of Canadian Academies also studied the question. They concluded that there's no evidence to support providing MAID solely for mental illness, but of course our government's going to go ahead with that anyway, starting in March of next year. Well, this is interesting. This report just came out because the government, so October 19th, you see this news report, and it's by, it was put in, Vice is the news service that carried it. So what happened is that the government was having a conference in Victoria, BC on euthanasia for mental illness, which sort of makes sense. They're going to be bringing this in March of 2024. And part of that conference was looking at the question of euthanasia for drug addicts. The issue is that is drug addiction also a form of mental illness? And if it is, or if it can be determined to be a form of mental illness, then you can also have euthanasia for drug addicts. So here you see Dr. David Martel, who was the guy who was actually running that session. He's been a euthanasia provider since 2016, so since the beginning. And he told the reporter that he wasn't sure if he would provide MAID to a person with a substance use disorder. He wasn't sure he would, but he recognized that, and these assessments would be very tricky. Well, I would agree, they're probably very tricky. Nonetheless, he said it would be an option. So euthanasia for mental illness, and this is an important issue because when we were debating euthanasia for mental illness in Canada, I run the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, so obviously I was writing commentaries and I was publishing commentaries constantly and spreading the news by my concerns about this. Nonetheless, nobody talked about euthanasia for drug addicts. It's after that now we're talking about euthanasia for drug addicts. Think about the issue. I don't know if any of you have been to Vancouver. Probably a couple of you have been to Vancouver. It's possible. I know Kevin's been to Vancouver. But anyway, we have a serious problem with homelessness in Vancouver. A serious problem. Not only Vancouver, Toronto, London, Ontario, we have a very serious problem with homelessness. And a lot of those people are people who have mental health issues. A lot of those people are people who have addiction issues. So it's very sad. These people do need support and help. There's no question about it. But now that we've changed the laws, some of them are going to qualify for death. We move on. The Parliamentary Committee on MAID. So what happened is the government, after passing Bill C-7, they set up a committee to look at further expansions of the issue. They looked at issues such as euthanasia for mature minors. A mature minor would be like someone who's under 18 but is considered capable of consenting, right? And also euthanasia by advance directive. So during the parliamentary committee hearings, the Quebec College of Physicians made a presentation on euthanasia for mature minors, and being progressives that they are, they said that they supported euthanasia for mature minors, but they also thought that we should extend that to newborns, children, infanticide. And they're saying this because they're saying, well, these children are born with different disabilities, etc. Now, why is this so important to me when I say this? Because, I mean, all of this is pretty bad in my eyes, but, you know, right off the bat, remember, euthanasia was sold to us in Canada under the concept of freedom of choice and autonomy for adults who were competent and capable of consenting. They said we were going to limit it to adults who are competent, who are capable of consenting. Obviously, mature minors are not adults. They might be capable of consenting in a sense. I'm not going to argue that. But what about a newborn? What about an infant? Like, I mean, the concept of consent was supposed to be fundamental, and obviously it's not. I think the concept of death is fundamental. But when you add euthanasia for mature minors and you add euthanasia by advance request, it also really changes this whole question of consent and the nature of consent. Because we're not talking about the same type of a consent when we're talking about mature minors and people by advanced request. So what I mean by advanced request is I'm 55. If I were to write out a document, like an advance directive saying I would want euthanasia in certain medical conditions, and let's say I became incompetent, that means the person who I assigned to be my medical decision maker would have to tell the doctor, you have to kill Alex because he asked for it in his advanced request. That's a totally different issue of consent, isn't it? That's a very different question. We move on. Euthanasia is sold to the culture as enabling personal autonomy and choice. They say it's my body, it's my choice. First of all, euthanasia is not about autonomy and choice in that way at all, because if someone else is actually injecting you, a physician, in Canada it's physicians or nurse practitioners who can do it, they're actually injecting you. You might have requested it. It's not the same idea as autonomy when someone else is killing you. All right? Anyway, we're told that it's for people who are suffering and nearing death. Well, obviously, chronic conditions are not nearing death. Most of these people are not actually suffering. If you look at the data, they might be in fear of suffering. We're told that euthanasia is not a form of suicide because these people are rationally choosing death. Are they all rationally choosing death? My experience is they're not all rationally choosing death. All these points are either philosophically wrong or usually not the case. I talk about this as sort of like the big lie. If you hear it enough, you're going to believe it. We move on. Kevin's got his head nodding because he knows exactly what I'm talking about. He saw the Canadian news. See, how did they legalize euthanasia in Canada? Well, first of all, it went to the courts. But secondly, how did they convince Canadians that this was such a good idea? We went through news story after news story after news story. It was a constant, one after the other of stories of people who should have euthanasia. and that was through 2015 and 2016. It was constant, one after another after another. Obviously, the people who were pro-euthanasia were effective at digging up their stories because they were just rolling constantly. It wasn't two at a time. It was like one and then another one. It was constant. Most people die by euthanasia. You know, this is the big question to me. Why do people actually ask for euthanasia? That's the essential question to me. Why is that so important? Because I actually realize that for most people, they don't necessarily want death. They're dealing with a situation in their life, right? Most people who die by euthanasia, they're asking for what reason? Well, they are going through a difficult health condition, whether that's physical or psychological. It's absolutely true. There's no question about it. But they're also usually feeling depressed or lonely. We have a lot of loneliness in the culture, more than ever before. They're feeling that their life is hopeless. They believe that their life has lost meaning, purpose, or value. And I talk to a lot of people who have been approved for euthanasia. We do have a helpline, and people call, and you're dealing with people, you're dealing with their families. It's a constant thing that we're dealing with, and everyone says the same thing. I see no purpose in my life. I see no reason to continue. The one person said to me, there's nobody in my life. I have no reason to live. I have nobody in my life, was what he said to me. Therefore, legalizing euthanasia is not about freedom, it's about abandonment. We're abandoning people at their time of need. I call them deaths of despair. These are deaths of despair. We move on. And so like the Netherlands and Belgium, it's the same problem that would happen here if you legalize. There is only one line in the sand. You think you can create a new line. You can say, oh, well, if we have this safeguard and that safeguard and that safeguard, we can create a new line in the sand. But there is only one line in the sand, and that is it's either I can kill you or I can't. You cross the line, you've got a problem. Because, you know, Canada's talking about euthanasia for people who are incompetent. We're talking about that. There's a lot of discussion now about people who have Alzheimer's, dementia. They want euthanasia by advance request. Why? Because they say, isn't it terrible that these people with dementia can't have euthanasia? So we should let them have it by advanced request. So if there's an advanced request, we can kill these people with dementia. You know what happens then if we actually do that? Then what happens to the people who didn't make an advanced request, and these families are so distraught by their mother, who is obviously losing her ability to recognize them and everything. And these are not beautiful conditions at times. I understand. Now, we can properly care for people. I'm not suggesting that these people are not being properly cared for or can't be properly cared for. But the point of it is then they start saying, but mom wouldn't have wanted to be like that. Once consent is out of the basket, why wouldn't you cause their death? Because it would seem terrible that you didn't. Because they're like this, right? There's only one clear line in the sand, and that is you do not kill. Once you cross that line, what are we doing? We're only debating the reasons why we kill and who does the killing. That's what we're debating. For instance, in the U.S., I'm just going to throw this in, they've been expanding their laws. They've been amending their laws. The first law that was amended was in 2019, the Oregon law. But most of their laws now have been expanding who can do the killing. So you look at Washington State's new law. They expanded their law to allow nurses to do it. New Mexico's allowed nurses to do it. Also, they're expanding, the reasons and the conditions. Well, why would they have to expand who can do the killing? Because there's very few doctors who want to do the killing. So obviously, if you need more people who are willing to do it, then you expand who can do it. That's why Canada in the beginning added doctors and nurse practitioners, because they looked at the polling and they realized few doctors actually wanted to do it. So if you add in nurse practitioners, then you might get a few more, right? This is what it's all about, the question of who can kill. So the problem with all these safeguards they talk about, they say, oh, well, we can have a safe law. Well, the problem with that is once they have legalized, everything changes. So what happened in Canada with the expansion is, why did they say you have to go away from terminal illness alone? They said, well, the problem with terminal illness is it denies euthanasia to people who aren't terminally ill. And if you have a chronic condition, it's discrimination not to allow them to have the equal right to euthanasia. All of these things become a form of discrimination because you had a safeguard. They have to overcome the safeguard. The safeguard was put in there in the first place. Why? To sell the law. They needed those sets of rules to make it, palatable for politicians to vote yes. But once they voted yes and it's legal, then they have to remove those restrictions because they're seen as discrimination. They hinder upon the equality of the person. And Canada's big into equality, so anyway, we move on, and that's it. So we're an organization that has about 7,000 members. I do have a few things with me that you can pick up. I got my latest pamphlet. It's called Canada's MAID Program Has Gone Mad, and it's got a lot of the stories in it you heard today. And you can take them. I have them here. I'm not charging you anything for them. I got another pamphlet called Carry Not Killing. I've got my latest newsletter. I've got a Do Not Kill Me card. It's easier than a tattoo. And I've got my Fatal Flaws film, and if you've got 10 pounds, I'll give it to you. Thank you very much.
That's great, Alex. Thank you very much. Our second speaker this evening, we're being invaded by Canadians tonight, but our second speaker of this evening is also a Canadian, Kevin Newell. He's actually a professor of American history, but more importantly on this subject, he is, or was the founder of Humanists Against Assisted Suicide. Kevin comes from a slightly different angle. He is a self-confessed atheist who describes himself as generally liberal. But the bit that Kevin really argues, and why he argues against assisted dying, is that he says very clearly that assisted dying should not be medical treatment for anyone. So, Kevin, if you'd like to come to the stage. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to be quite brief. By the way, just in terms of the pictures, I couldn't think of any appropriate pictures to put up, so I put up my holiday snaps from Canada. So you can regale, if you get sick of the topic, then you can have a look at those. That's in Jasper Park, by the way. So that's what I'm going to be speaking about tonight. Next slide, please. So as I've been introduced, I'm an atheist. I'm generally liberal. I support abortion rights, which many people will not in this room. And I oppose capital punishment. And I do not oppose assisted suicide and euthanasia per se, in very specific individual circumstances that are rare. But what I object to is a change in the law. So I'm against the institutionalization of killing. Even for the very best possible reasons, I think killing is wrong, and I think we should continue to think that. So my case, it should not be medical treatment for anyone. It's not necessary, it's harmful, and it's wrong, morally wrong. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to say is a word about language, because I think we deceive ourselves with this. So assisted dying, so to speak, is medicalized killing. And it's put in these nice words that sound very lovely and medicalized, like a nice person in a white coat's going to come and help you, rather than what it is. It is killing. It's either killing another person or it's killing yourself. And I think, also the term assisted dying doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't actually clarify anything. It covers medical aid, or medical aid in dying is the Canadian way of putting it. But it covers both assisted suicide and euthanasia. And of course, that's not really particularly helpful, because in every other language, there is a distinction. People will say suicide. It's only in the English language countries that people are objecting to the term suicide, the taint of suicide we hear so often. And yet, that's a lie. And I don't think we should be able to let people lie to us about the language. I think the language, deceptive language, is a very bad thing. We should be honest with ourselves in this discussion. Now, of course, the quickest and most painless deaths that you could ever have would be a guillotine. But that brings it home a little bit too much what the reality is of assisted suicide and euthanasia. So it's not really medical at all. In fact, if you had a guillotine, you could operate it yourself. but it's medicalized. And I think this makes people feel better about the action. It's almost like they have, for this atheist, they have chased away the priest from the bedside and brought in a doctor to give absolution. Yes, you are suffering. And I think it's a lot about that. Next slide. So what's the evidence from other countries? Assisted suicide only is legal, currently legal in Switzerland and 10 states and territories within the United States. Euthanasia only is legal in Belgium, but euthanasia and assisted suicide are legal in the Netherlands, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Canada, Colombia, and Australia. Spain and Portugal has passed a law, but it has not quite got through the courts. We expect that it probably will. It's not moving as fast as, this sounds very depressing, but of course, there have been more than 250 legislative attempts in the United States to actually legalize assisted suicide, and yet only 10 of them have actually worked. So this is not like, for instance, gay marriage, which swept the board. It's a different thing, and I'm quite hopeful about the ability of all of us who are opposed to it to actually put a stop to it. Another thing we should know is that both processes use sodium thiopental or pentobarbital commonly. Now, those are the same drugs used for capital punishment in the United States, and those are the same drugs that people are opposing because it's called cruel and unusual punishment. Yet, they are putting it through for assisted suicide and euthanasia under the rubric assisted dying. So, as opponents of capital punishment point out, lethal injection is designed to create the appearance of serenity in a painless death rather than actually providing it. Next slide, please. So the other thing we should say, what is the evidence that comes out from places where it is legal? Physical pain is not the main reason for doing it. It's not much of an issue as much as is existential pain. So in Oregon reports, which have been conducted since 1998, pain has never entered the top 5 reasons why people opt for an assisted suicide. And in not any other country has it come in the top reasons why people are actually having this. This is about existential pain. And that's why it's being brought in, not for physical pain, but existential pain. But even in the Netherlands, there's a very interesting study that's come out quite recently that shows that pain and restlessness are not solved by, or not achieved in the last days, hours, and weeks of life in up to 42.8% of cases. And this is in a place where euthanasia has been legal and is fairly common, is institutionalized, is common or garden for over 20 years. So, as Alex made the point, suffering is subjective. And as we are seeing in Canada, people have been granted euthanasia for reasons of poverty, homelessness, and lack of adequate health care. And why not, if you think about it? And I predicted this, sadly, in my 2013 book on the subject, that the categories would expand. Why would they expand? Because how can you deny, if you define assisted suicide and euthanasia as health care, how can you deny it to anyone who needs it? And of course, the need is unbearable suffering. So therefore, how can you deny it to children? How can you deny it to people who are suffering from mental conditions? How can you deny it to somebody who is in poverty and feels that that's the worst possible situation that they can be in? That's why I think the safeguards will fall. If you pass it in Jersey, the safeguards will fall away. That's my prediction. And sadly, as I said in 2013, that's, since then, it has come to fruition. Next slide, please. So, other predictions. Euthanasia, as Alex said, euthanasia and not assisted suicide will become the rule. Why? 2 reasons. I think, first of all, assisted suicide is not a reliable way, or it's not quite as reliable as a way to bring about a painless death. But even more, people want the absolution from the doctor. They want the doctor to deliver this. They want to pretend it's health care. It's not suicide. Oh no, it's not killing. No, this is health care. And that's, the image is very important for this, and I think that's why people get doctors to do it more. And as Alex said, in 10,000 cases in Canada in 2022, fewer than 7 were actually assisted suicide. So yes, the other things we know, the numbers increase, as Alex showed in that chart, Canada increased, but in every single place where it has been legalized, the numbers have significantly increased. The categories increase. Every single country in the world where it's been legal for some time, safeguards were loosened. Belgium has extended it to children in 2014. And the Netherlands has plans to do so next year. And Canada is actively, as Alex was talking about, is actively considering it. Even in Oregon, where we're told Oregon is a great model for assisted suicide. In Oregon, they have dropped the cooling off period, which has moved to, it can be done in the same day, basically, after your request, rather than having a cooling off period. So it's easier in some circumstances than buying insurance, where you have to have a cooling off period. So it's expanded everywhere. The category is expanded. And as I've explained, this is natural, because if people are suffering, how can you deny it to them? How can you do that? So in Canada, the term reasonably foreseeable, we've heard about this. I won't have to go into this because Alex has done such an excellent job of telling us about what the situation in Canada. But it's also being, I think this is one thing to look at, it's being considered for people who are tired of life, particularly in the Netherlands, where there's been they've managed to get 100,000 signatures, over 100,000 signatures, and the support of major political parties to get everybody over the age of 75 who is tired of life the ability to have euthanasia. So in Canada, this has also been talked about in the same talk that Alex talked about where they moved it, the Quebec group also talked about extending it to seniors. So there's a prediction. It will be extended to seniors. Next slide, please. So in terms of the history, and please ask me history questions. I miss being a lecturer these days. I'm retired, so. There are 2 consistent themes that have happened about the history of euthanasia and assisted suicide. The 2 themes are compassion and utility. There is no question that the people who are opposed to my point of view and think that assisted suicide is a good thing do have that idea of compassion. I think that has been the case. It has first been raised as a serious proposal in 1870, and ever since then, you've had compassion and utility. Autonomy has never been an important motivation until it's been used to sell it much more recently. So why not all suicides? If it's about autonomy, my body, my choice, how could you deny it to anybody who is suicidal? That is not autonomy. It's also extended to children. Children are not autonomous beings. They cannot be. We don't ask them various different questions, like, for instance, a child of 10 is not allowed to do with their body whatever they want to do. And why would they be extended to euthanasia? It's not about autonomy. That's the point I want to make. Historically, autonomy only became important in the 1930s with the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, which was the forerunner of dignity in dying. And they put in voluntary because euthanasia was not selling very well. Also, compassion was used. If you ever get a chance to, if you're ever very bored on an evening and you want to watch a good film, if a little bit depressing, Ich klag an, if that's the German pronunciation, I'm looking at Alex for that, is a very, very useful film. It was commissioned because posters like that one up there, which are based on utility, which are based on saying, look at this poor man, he's supporting all of these useless people. Wouldn't we be better off if they were dead? And now it was argued that, in fact, it would be better off for you in certain circumstances. So compassion replaced utility as a propaganda tool in 1941. It could be that actually Switzerland was influenced by Ich klag an. That's the only other place it was actually shown, was Germany and Switzerland. So they legalized assisted suicide in 1942. Perhaps that was part of the reason why. But compassion became the key reason after the utility aspects, as illustrated in that poster, were gone. Next slide, please. So assisted dying rapidly becomes a way of ridding society of those who it deems as leading inconvenient lives. Inconvenient lives to all of us, and inconvenient lives to themselves. Utility is an important motivation, really, since euthanasia was first proposed in 1870. It has never been entirely dropped. It's moved to the background because it does not sell euthanasia very well. So in the recent Canadian government report, what you have called in the report, I say you, probably not anybody here, but whoever is proposing in the Jersey legislation, track 1 and track 2, track 1 euthanasia would save $13,000, $442 per patient, according to this government report. I think that's a gross underestimation as well, particularly of the total of $135,276,350. That's an underestimation. Track 2, the estimated savings would be 4 times as much. That's when you have people who are not terminally ill, and they estimate how much they would save. And don't take this, you know, like, don't believe me if you want, but go and have a look at some of the articles that have come out about this, like Counting the Cost of Denying Assisted Dying by 2 British authors in ethics. And they make the point that there is a very good economic argument for assisted dying, which is the QALY gain, quality assisted living years, I believe that's the term, through organ donation. So all of this, there are utilitarian concerns that come underneath this. Next slide, please. So my case, despite being an atheist, you might find this surprising, is moral. I think the case against killing is moral. I actually think that the Christian precept of thou shalt not kill is worth keeping, even if you don't believe in God. And I just want to finish with this story about Margaret Mead, a famous anthropologist, and she makes the point that when she was asked in class when the first true evidence of civilization was, and she said, she held a bone, a femur, aloft, and she said, it's when somebody had to care. Somebody must have cared for this injured person, and somebody must have hunted on his behalf, brought him food, and served him at great personal sacrifice. And she was making the point that this is when civilization happened, when we didn't leave the weak out to die, when we stopped sacrificing those who lead inconvenient lives, when we afforded a protection to all of the community, and when we gave equal moral value to all human lives. And that this is when civilization really began. And this principle is perhaps the least tangible of all of the effects of legalizing assisted suicide and euthanasia, but it's the most important to me. And it's undermined and threatened by legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide. Next slide, please. So to end, my advice to Jersey is think again. Think again about this law that has been passed in principle, and I hope you all will do that.
Thank you, Kevin. And now, for our third speaker of the evening, we're going to go a little bit closer to home. We've got Dr. Carol Davis, who is a specialist palliative care consultant in Southampton, but she's actually got over 13 years of links to care in Jersey through her work with Jersey Hospice. Carol spoke earlier at our event earlier on in the year, and I'd like to welcome her to the stage now. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me. I've been asked to share with you some musings. I want to muse with you about the potential impact of legalising assisted dying on palliative care. Now, I'm going to start in a moment with a bit of clarification, and I make no apologies for that. Next slide, please. In 2021, an online survey, and I did show, if any of you were here in January, or in a different venue in January, I did share this slide, but it's really important, I think. There was an online survey, and it asked the public what you understand by assisted dying. I'll use my pointer. The grey bit was don't know, and the rest are labelled. So 10% thought that assisted dying was providing hospice-type care, 42% thought it was stopping life-sustaining treatment, and 43% got it right. 43% realised that it was giving people drugs with the sole intention of killing them. Now, what I think is really important about this is I don't know how many surveys any of you answer, but usually people might answer a survey like this because they think they know something about it. So if that's the case, then the people who possibly thought they knew a lot about it, a lot didn't. Next slide, please. Sorry about all the words on this slide. It's just to remind me what I do every day. Anyway, you can read it more quickly than I can say it. I just want to put out a few key words about modern palliative care. It's proactive, it's flexible. You can dip in and out of palliative care. When I first qualified as a doctor, in the East End of London, at a London hospital. If I referred somebody to the hospice, and there was one of the earlier hospices there, St Joseph's Hospice, I filled in a form, and they were only accepted if the box was ticked that said I thought they'd got less than 6 weeks to live. Now hospices have gyms and cafeterias, not for the staff, but for the ill people. Okay? So key things on here are any serious disease or frailty and their families, highly individualised, carefully tailored, and then the last 3 points, or last 3 points, restoring hope now and for tomorrow, and facilitating a peaceful, dignified death when that time comes. And it extends into bereavement. Next slide, please. So here we have a slide, and I hope nobody in this room is touched by motor neuron disease. I don't know that. So if you are in any way, I apologise for taking this as an example. But people with motor neuron disease is a group of people who are often cited as people who would want a medically assisted death. So say somebody's got motor neuron disease and their respiratory muscles are weakening. They will die of that. But they have choices, big choices. They can choose, if they wish, to start non-invasive ventilation, a mask on their face that puts oxygen under pressure into their lungs and keeps them alive, at least for longer than they would have had. But if they choose that, they can also choose when to stop it. So there's lots of choices here. And one of the things that gets my goat, or my bee in my bonnet, is the fact that dignity and choice are words that have been sort of stolen away from palliative care, I feel, by the pro-euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide lobbies. And actually, this is absolutely full of choice. So they can choose to stop when they want to. And they can then rest assured that they will be cared for with meticulous attention to symptom control and in a highly individualised way. And any drugs they need will be tailored to them. This is not a pharmacology session, but you think about the age of the person, what's wrong with the person, their body weight, how they are, what their problems are, what their kidneys are doing, what their liver's doing. Drug prescribing isn't just a blunderbuss bang of a big dose of things. Next slide, please. Let's compare that with euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Here, somebody it's certainly in track 1, most of the time, the people thought to have a terminal illness, is going to be dying sometime in the next 6 or maybe 6 to 12 months. But they die before that because they're given drugs with the express intention of killing them. So they die prematurely. And to me, these two things are very, very different, morally, ethically, and legally. But there's an enormous amount of confusion about it. And I hope that might have clarified things a little bit. Next, please. And then lastly, before some other musings, we just need to think about life expectancy. Because if one of the criteria is thought to be having less than 6 months to live, how good are we at telling that? The answer is pretty useless, I'm afraid, and even worse than when I first qualified as a doctor or when I first became a palliative medicine consultant 31 years ago. We're worse at it, not because we're worse healthcare professionals, but because things are more complicated. There's more things that you can do if people want for a wide plethora of problems. It's prognostication, crystal ball gazing as to how long someone's got to live is more complex now than it's ever been, and it's likely to get even more so. So it's most accurate when it's the expected life expectancy is really, really short. But even then we get it badly wrong. Sometimes, and it's least accurate when it stretches to many weeks or months, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's people in the room with personal experience of that in different ways. And in Oregon, there's numbers of patients or numbers of ill people who requested the drugs to take at the time of their choice, didn't take it, and were still alive 3 years later. But they all qualified for it on the grounds of having less than 6 months to live. So that's how inaccurate this is. I was going to tell a story. I will tell a story. I will tell a story? Yeah, I will. John likes my stories. I will tell a story, and it's my favourite story. And again, some of you may have heard it before, but please listen to it again. We'll call him Steve, was a young man with cystic fibrosis. And he had really severe cystic fibrosis. There's a wide spectrum in CF. He was at the worst end of that spectrum. And he knew that he was not going to make, his words, not mine, old bones. And he was getting iller and iller, and he was spending more and more time on antibiotics, mainly in hospital. He was spending over half his life in repeated hospital admissions. In fact, it was more like 2/3. But in between times, he wasn't quite so bad, and he thought that was okay. And then the COVID pandemic, we had stories of COVID earlier, the COVID pandemic struck. And he was petrified by what he watched on the news. He was petrified of going into hospital. He was convinced he'd get COVID and die of COVID if he went into hospital. So he stayed at home, and he got iller and iller and iller. And he told me later that he would have happily paid somebody to kill him at that point in time. But then he felt so blimmin' awful that he rang up and he said, he knew the palliative care team as well as the cystic fibrosis team. He said, can you, both teams, look after me and see if you can help me feel better? And we did. And I did the feeling better bit with my colleagues, and the cystic fibrosis team did the clever stuff. And he did get better. And I have to say, rather against the odds, he'd nearly died several times. But he did get better, and he got well enough to go out of hospital. But what is really important is he, by then, was eligible for one of the brand new disease-modifying drugs for cystic fibrosis, cutting-edge stuff. And he hadn't been eligible for that before. And he started that drug, and if it works really quickly. And it worked really quickly. And he did not come into hospital for another year. He regained his zest for life, and he got a girlfriend, and all sorts of other good things happened in his life. And that's the power of new treatments coming online. And that has to be factored in somehow. I have no idea how you do, and I too think the easiest thing is not to go anywhere near assisted dying, but I'll come to that in a minute. Next slide, please. So now some musings specifically about palliative care, because that's what I was asked to do. So I've just got 3 topics here that I've picked out. The first one is, do hospices embrace assisted dying services? So in Oregon, and this data is old, but Alex might be able to come up with something more recent, but I couldn't find it. But 2/3 of hospices didn't allow their staff to take part in assisted deaths. And in New Zealand, where the legislation is fresher, newer, for want of a better description, all but one hospice has refused to participate. Next, please. This is taken from the Jersey Hospice Care website. It's on there now. The European Association of Palliative Care has declared that the provision of euthanasia and assisted dying shall not be included in the practice of palliative care, a position that has remained unchanged for 50 years. This is a position that we support, and we believe that there is a very clear boundary between palliative and end-of-life care and assisted dying. Next. Second, is there a negative impact or a positive impact of legalization of assisted dying on hospices and palliative care services? Well, medically assisted deaths, as you've seen, are cheaper than hospice care. It's recently been calculated that one Canadian assisted death costs the same as 1 week of UK hospice care. And a point that I don't think we've touched on yet is that for years we've been trying to persuade people that palliative care is about the care of dying when they're dying, but actually it's about people living as well as they possibly can until they're dying, whenever that time is. And we've spent enormous amounts of time and energy dispelling big myths and fears about hospice care. And yet, in Canada, people are now scared of going into some of the hospices because they believe that they will be killed. And the doctors there are under an obligation to talk to them about medically assisted deaths. And once a doctor starts to talk about it, even whatever that doctor's view, I think that suggests that that doctor condones that and thinks it's the right option for you. Okay, next slide, please. And in Belgium and Holland, growth stalled in home care, hospital, and inpatient palliative care services, and in the European countries where assisted dying is not legal. And please remember, proponents of assisted dying make it out that most of the world have access to assisted dying. It's way under that. It's way under 5%. I think it's about 3% now of the world's population live in places where this is now legal. And the growth in the countries where it's not legal has been much, much faster than in the countries where it's been legalized, ditto in Oregon. Next slide, please. It's worse than that, though, I'm afraid. So in some jurisdictions, palliative care has gone backwards. So in New South Wales, Australia, again, one of the countries or territories where this has been relatively recently legalized, $120 million reduction in palliative care funding was announced a short time ago, with a 97 million injection of funding into assisted dying. And in Canada, you've heard lots about Canada, but I want to do this from the palliative care angle. Hospices are refusing to offer assisted deaths because it's always assumed that people like me will be doing this. Well, I won't be, I can tell you, not least because I'm going to retire very soon. But putting that to one side, I still wouldn't be. But so hospices refusing to offer assisted deaths have their funding stopped and have been taken possession of by the state. And I quote that, and interestingly, that was Fraser Health as well, wasn't it, Alex? And, yep. And I've read the newspaper reports on it, which you too could find online if you want. And the hospice was possessed by the state because they would not take part in having assisted dying happening on their premises. Next slide, please. And the last one is a little bit more convoluted, but could the involvement of palliative care be a safeguard? You've heard about safeguards, and there's safeguards are what proponents of this say and what legislators in the first place say, possibly rightly if those safeguards really worked, which they often don't, would make this all right, make it safe. So if referral to palliative care was a safeguard built in about this, then early referral would be required of anyone thinking or talking about the possibility of considering a medically assisted death. And I believe that that should stipulate the referrals should be to a specialist palliative care team. There's lots and lots of palliative care goes on in all sorts of healthcare and other places. But actually, a multi-professional specialist team with extra training in this is what is required for complex situations. And by golly, this is a complex situation. Also, a one-off consultation just does not cut the mustard. So if I'm seeing somebody, let's go to my clinical hat for a minute. If I'm seeing someone who's very breathless, the first time I see them, I might watch their body posture and talk about anxiety and panic, and if they say yes, and I might do lots of non-drug stuff like relax, let your muscles breathe with you, not against you, and a whole load of other stuff, okay? And I may or may not, depending on how that person is, give them a prescription for something they could take if and when they needed it, if those non-drug things didn't work. And then the next time I see them, which could be very soon afterwards or might be a week afterwards, it will depend on the person, I'll be reviewing it. And either they'll be better or they won't. But you have to keep reviewing, and you have to be alongside people. So I've given a drug example, but I could have given one about the more psychological side of this, about being alongside people. So a one-off consultation doesn't cut the mustard. So that all sounds okay, maybe, but it would increase the demand for palliative care services, which would need resourcing. Next slide. Again, a quote from Canada. Leonie Herx was over on the island earlier in the year, and she's recently written a paper with some colleagues called Palliative Care was supposed to be a safeguard for MAID. Instead, it's becoming a casualty. So, interestingly, even though in Canada at that time, less than 50% of people with a perceived need for palliative care were receiving palliative care, part of the process for informed consent for a medically assisted death was to offer palliative care. So people were offered palliative care, and that was not defined, and still isn't, and it's mainly offered by non-specialists, and it's mainly one-off. So it does not meet the things that I went through in the last slide with you. And that paper by Leonie and et al. Ends with, it's far too little and too late to mention palliative care only after a patient has already asked to be killed. It needs to be proactive. It needs to be earlier, okay? Next slide, please. And then the effect on training. So palliative care is already competing with many other strands of healthcare for space within undergraduate curriculae. In fact, I can tell you that when I was involved very heavily in medical student teaching in the 1990s, there was more palliative medicine in the curriculum in Southampton for medical students than there is now, despite us trying to not be pushed out. And that will keep happening because they've got to learn all about the complex new things as well. And in Canada, there's been a reduction in palliative care content, specifically, I'm told, by Leonie and others, to make space for the addition of teaching about assisted dying, with the expectation that if you teach the doctors of the future how to do it, they'll all get up and go off and do that. Okay, just a couple of concluding points. Thank you. Next slide. So I think what this island is being asked to look at is a really profound change with a really profound impact, mainly for ill people and their families. It means that everyone living with a potentially life-shortening illness or disability will be faced with a new question, as will anyone caring for them. Should I artificially shorten my life by taking lethal drugs? As well as all of that, there's a likely profound negative effect on palliative care. And these are some of the reasons, and I've stuck to what I was asked to talk about mainly, but these are some of the reasons why I believe you shouldn't be looking at changing the law, you should be looking at improving the care. Thank you.
Some very powerful messages there again. Thank you, Carol. Our final speaker of the evening, before we then go to Q&A session, is Dr. Rachel Ruddy, who's the clinical lead for psychiatry in Jersey. So please, welcome to the stage, Rachel. But then just remember, guys, we are going to do the open question and answer session. So make sure you jot it down or make a mental note. And Rachel, over to you. Thank you.
Good evening. I bet you all feel like standing up and having a good stretch. It's been a long stint, hasn't it? I'm Rachel Ruddy. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and I'm the clinical lead for mental health care here in Jersey. And I work with our Duty of Care Jersey and the Jersey Dying Well group. And as such, I don't really just stand here for myself. I stand here to represent the 160 plus healthcare practitioners in Jersey who've said in writing to the Health Minister that they do not want to work in a system where assisted dying is part of healthcare. Now, my topic tonight is assisted dying for mental illness. And you may wonder why I'm talking about this when the Jersey law is not proposing assisted dying for mental illness. Well, I think you've heard a number of things tonight which will make you realise why I'm so concerned about it. Alex has really nicely talked about how the medical principle of justice, that if you're doing one thing to one person, it's not fair to not do it to another person, allows whatever law comes in to extend. So if for terminally ill, why not for chronically ill? If for physically ill, why not for mentally ill? And further, if for people who can consent, why for people who can't consent? And for advanced directives. And why just for patients? You know, why not just for anybody who suffers, as we've heard in Canada, for people who suffer in poverty or suffer from lacking home care support? And then really, as Kevin's talked about, actually, if you're going to let people commit suicide, why for suffering anyway? Why not just let anyone who wants to commit suicide by this method? Once we say it's okay for a doctor to kill a patient, the door is open and it gradually gets pushed wider and wider. The other reason I'm concerned about this in Jersey is that people rarely have just one condition. In fact, evidence suggests that over 45% of people with a significant mental illness will also have a long-term physical health condition. And in other countries, a mix of low-level physical health conditions is all you would need to qualify. If this was the case in Jersey, someone with a mental health condition could easily apply on the basis of their minor physical health conditions that are causing suffering. You may think, well, this is mad. Surely they would be screened as part of the assessment process, and that assessor would recognise the role of mental illness in driving their motivation for death. But again, evidence from countries which have assisted dying have very low rates of people being referred for psychiatric opinions. In 2021, only 2 patients seeking physician-assisted suicide in Oregon were referred for psychiatric assessment. Also, a Belgium study showed that a psychiatric opinion wouldn't be a safeguard anyway, because the treating physician can override the consultant's objections to euthanasia, and doctor shopping can easily occur. Next slide. In countries which have legalised assisted dying for mental illness, the numbers are not insignificant. Particularly, you'll see on this in Switzerland that 17% of assisted deaths among foreign nationals are for mental illness. Next slide. This graph shows the rising rates in the Netherlands, and we've talked about this, how it doesn't just stay static, the numbers increase. And since it was legalised, it's interesting that in euthanasia, the majority of these deaths for psychiatric conditions are occurring in a specific centre, not in standard healthcare. Now, in Jersey, we're proposing a specific service for this, and I do worry about what that might lead to here. When a researcher went back and looked at the paperwork for Dutch psychiatric-assisted deaths, they found that 55% of people were depressed, 11% had had no psychiatric input at all, and 20% had never had a psychiatric inpatient stay for assessment and treatment. Now, to me, that says that those people had not received all possible treatment for their illnesses that might well have changed their decision about whether or not to seek death. Also note the number of deaths that are rising for people with dementia. Now, these statistics are separate to the 115. So there were 6 people with advanced dementia in 2021 and 216 with earlier stage dementia. These people would not have had capacity to consent at the time of death. We really need to think about the potential effects of these practices on the public trust towards medicine. Could this become a normal decision-making route for our geriatric clinician colleagues who might advise assisted death in these conditions? Might there be a decreased incentive for research into the treatment for dementia? Interestingly, there are over 140 drugs in clinical trials at the moment trying to treat dementia. Would we just lose all interest in that if people can just have assisted deaths? This is really relevant for Jersey law, which is proposing that if someone loses capacity, their advance decision for assisted dying will still stand, and this includes dementia. So, whatever law we bring in Jersey, this will affect people with mental illness. Next slide, please. I have used this slide before. But as a psychiatrist, this is one of my primary concerns. Where does the line fall between suicide prevention and suicide promotion? In Canada, there's a national suicide prevention hotline you can call 24/7, where sympathetic operators will try and talk you out of killing yourself. But today there are also euthanasia hotlines, where operators will give you the resources you need to carry out your wish. Now in Jersey, we haven't even got a suicide prevention strategy yet, and yet we're considering offering healthcare assistance for suicide. Next slide. As a psychiatrist, I work day in, day out dealing with people who are suicidal and thinking about suicide prevention. And this whole topic really raises the question for me, what about the impact on suicide rates, the background suicide rates? Now, this is a really difficult question to answer. Suicide is a complicated area to study. But what I want to show you in this graph is that there is no evidence at all to support the argument that assisting people to die will reduce suicide rates. And that is often an argument used by the people promoting this. One feature that has emerged from these studies looking at suicide rates, though, is the importance of gender. Women are more than twice as likely as men to request and receive assisted dying for psychiatric disorders in the countries where it is available. And we don't really know why that is. But what I will say is that is the opposite of suicide statistics. We know that women might be more likely to attempt suicide, but they are not more likely to complete it. So what you have to ask is whether these laws are helping them succeed. It can also be really hard to assess suicidal thoughts and know that someone requesting an assisted death has a really settled wish to die. It's estimated that about 1% of older people without severe illness will talk about being ready to die. I remember my grandparents doing it. But only 1/7 of those will really want to end their lives. Death wishes can also be linked to depression, and they can respond to treatment. Depression can respond to treatment even in people with terminal illnesses. Next slide, please. Assisted dying for mental illness raises some huge questions, some of which you've already heard talk about tonight. There are real problems with the terminology in this debate. The Jersey law tries to say that assisted dying is not suicide, but this is just wrong. In a situation where somebody wants to die and they're being helped to die and is suicidal, what else do you call it? Because actually, for my patients who have tried to kill themselves, are we then saying there are tiers of acceptability in suicide? Secondly, with regard to assisted suicide or euthanasia, should there really be parity between non-terminal physical illness and mental illness? Are they really the same? Unfair discrimination only applies if there are no relevant differences between the two groups. But I think there are some really fundamental differences, not least of which is that one of the symptoms of depression is to feel suicidal. What other illness is that the case in? Secondly, we know that people with depression and many other psychiatric conditions can experience cognitive distortions. They can quite literally not think the same as someone without the disorder. How can somebody who finds it hard to think of a positive future or a future at all be able to make unhindered decisions about dying? Thirdly, as we've heard from Alex, although predicting outcome with most medical conditions is really quite tricky, mental illness is particularly prone to error. And research bears this out, with some studies saying that the accuracy of us as psychiatrists really knowing whether somebody with a long-term condition is going to get better is as little as 50%. That's like chance. So laws that do encompass terms like poor likelihood of recovery are going to struggle to be applied to mental illness. It's also really concerning that countries where assisted dying is happening, there's a push to create new diagnoses to make people eligible. For example, terminal anorexia. The criteria of this are unsound. And it does feel as though there are ulterior motives in that diagnosis around saving money on costly mental health care. And not to mention the hopelessness that terms like that build for the sufferer of the condition. Finally, are we really presenting everyone with the same choice when an assisted dying service is offered? In a study talking to people who provide medical assistance in dying in Canada, they said that in cases where people had unmet needs, they were usually related to loneliness and poverty, as we've heard. Now, as a white, British, fairly well-off consultant psychiatrist with no current mental illness, I have a privileged choice with regard to any legislation about assisted dying. Whatever my views are on this law, if it was enacted in Jersey or the UK, I could choose death from a long-term condition with no pressing financial burdens at a time that suited me. But the majority of the patients I treat with long-term mental health conditions would not be making the same choice as me. Unfortunately, those who do struggle with severe mental illness, learning disabilities, or neurodevelopmental disorders can have financial difficulties because they're unable to work. They may struggle with housing or supportive relationships. They may well feel lonely and isolated. The choice for an assisted death as an alternative to difficult social, economic, and emotional problems that life presents is really a different choice from those with more privileged circumstances. And any law that allows this could be seen as coercive for those who are vulnerable in our population. Next slide, please. I wanted to try and include the patient voice in this talk by introducing you to some of the patients with normal, treatable psychiatric conditions who have died an assisted death in the Netherlands and Belgium. Tyne Nice was depressed after a breakup of a relationship. She had suffered domestic violence, but she was euthanized in 2009 on the basis of autism. Godelieve de Troyer, 64, an otherwise healthy Belgian woman living with depression, was euthanized in 2012. Mark, who was 41, was alcohol dependent and ended his life by euthanasia to escape his addiction. How many people in Jersey struggle with addictions? Are we really going to propose euthanasia? Anne, 44, had experienced sexual abuse and had anorexia. And in the press last year was Shanti Decorti, who was euthanized for post-traumatic stress disorder after being affected by the ISIS bombing of a Belgian airport. So in conclusion, I hope you can see my concern that any assisted dying law is a threat to the care and treatment of people with mental illness. I concur with the findings of the recent Danish government's ethics review that states the very existence of an offer of euthanasia will decisively change our ideas about old age, the coming of death, quality of life, and what it means to take others into account. And the only way to protect the lives and respect of those who are the most vulnerable in society will be an unexceptional ban. Next slide, please. I'm aware that this evening might have been really difficult for some people listening. There may be people here who this has affected. And I just want to remind you that in Jersey, we have a 24/7 crisis service to support people with mental health concerns. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. So we've had 4 brilliant speakers, I think everybody would agree. We've heard some real-life stories coming out of Canada, and I keep going on. The reason we've brought in some Canadian speakers in the 2 events that we've held is because it's very real about what they have experienced there and what we potentially could be following in their footsteps. We've had from Carol a wonderful presentation explaining that actually by having to cram in even more into a student's learning, that they're taking away time spent on palliative care now to think about ways about assisted dying, which seems immoral and illogical. And then Rachel with some very specific cases relating to mental illness. So 4 very powerful presentations. And I'm hoping from the back, there is going to be a way that you're going to be able to submit questions which are magically going to appear to me. And then we're going to have, if we can have the speakers to come up on stage, and they will select who's going to answer it. Phil, have we got a link to where they can put it up? QR code. Use the QR code. Get your, if you get your smartphones out. Not everybody has a phone. I know that, don't worry. I can also see hands going up. There's a lady down here who's keen to answer one. But if some who do want to put it up, because they'll come through to me, so I'll then hopefully build up a bit of a bank of some questions here. But I will also take questions from the floor. So is everybody happy about the 2 ways to do it? And I'll look out through the lights. But, Madam, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you. I've written the question down, actually, all right, so my son is a 52-year-old...
Hang on, Madam, just 1 second, because otherwise the people behind you weren't here.
Yes, oh, thank you. I have a son who's 52 years of age. However, his mental age ranges between 6 years and 13 years. He's been diagnosed obviously as a child as severe learning difficulties, ankylosing spondylitis, and Writer's syndrome. And in spite of all of the above, he's a real gentle, sweet soul. But he aims to please everybody, so he says yes to everything, unfortunately. Now, I'm coming now in my older years, and I am very concerned, very, very concerned, because although I've got power of attorney now, what will happen when I'm not here? I do have 2 other children who actually, one lives in France and the other is about to live in France. So, yes, I'm really, really concerned and been concerned for some time. If I may just briefly say, I was quite ill for some time, and he had to go into a care home, nursing home, for a while. And I'm so sorry, but the care was almost non-existent, really. It was awful because they didn't cater for his needs. And yes,
Okay.
it took me a long time to get over that. So thank you.
So if this were in Canada, they couldn't approve assisted death for him at this point in time because obviously speaking, he wouldn't be considered competent to make decisions like that. My advice to you is, I'm assuming you are seen as the power of attorney for care. You are seen as the person who has the right to make medical decisions for him. That's right. So I would make sure that you have someone who you truly trust, who truly shares your values, who can do that if you become incapable of doing that anymore. Because you want to make sure that the next person, if you can't do that, like something were to happen to you, you have to make sure that that ability to make decisions for your son is passed to somebody who you truly do trust, shares your values. Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah. At this moment, you have power of attorney, right? Right, but in the future, if something were to happen, I'm not saying something will, but if it were to happen.
Okay, but for instance, with my children not living on the island, would now be better perhaps having my pastor or somebody like that to...
Well, I'm not going to suggest it. It's going to be someone who shares your values, who's willing to do it. Because obviously, if something were to happen to you, you would be concerned for your son. So therefore, you should make sure you've dealt with that ahead of time by appointing someone who would replace you if you can't do it.
I suppose what I would pick up on is your reflections on his time in the care facility, and just say, you know, in Jersey it would be great to see money going into enhancing our care facilities for all people who need to go into that level of care, really, wouldn't it? What a much better way to spend our money.
Right, I've got a question that's come through here. Is that how do you protect the rights, or how can you protect the rights of clinicians or carers who conscientiously object? Would somebody like to?
Well, what are they proposing in Jersey? Here's the problem. I'm in Ontario in Canada, and doctors are told they have to do what they call an effective referral. So doctors who are not, who do not believe in killing their patients, they don't have to do the act in any way, shape, or form, but they're told they must send their patient to somebody who will arrange to do the act. So right off the bat, that creates an immediate conscientious problem, because if you're not willing to kill somebody, you're not willing to send them to the killer either. So we've lost quite a few doctors in Ontario, and I could go on about stories about that. In British Columbia, this is the issue of palliative care, which is important. It's also Quebec now, but British Columbia is what she was referring to as the hospice that was taken by the government because they refused to do euthanasia. I'll just quickly tell you the story, because that's a conscientious objection story again. This hospice was right across the street from the local hospital. So somebody wanted medical aid in dying, euthanasia. There was no problem bringing them across the street. There was no issue. They were not preventing someone who said they wanted to die that way from doing it. They just said, we will not participate in any way here. We will not be having that in our hospice. It will not happen. So the government defunded them, shut them down, and expropriated their building. They had a 10-bed hospice in Delta, and that was expropriated from them by the government. So obviously speaking, the workers there who were not willing to participate, you lose your building, you lose your hospice because you're not willing to kill. So how do you do it? I don't know, because that's all government policy now, isn't it? The regulatory for the doctor, the regulatory group for the doctors, are they going to defend you? I don't know. That's up to the Jersey doctors if that happens.
I've got another one here, which is coming back to you, Alex. But what is the mood change in Canada? How much is this spoken about amongst the general population? Because there's clearly been a meteoric rise in a very short period of time. But what's the general mood of the people?
First of all, Canadians were brainwashed by it because we were constantly, there was an all-out campaign. So when I say it wasn't like there was 3 stories at a time, there was one story and then the next story and then the next story. That's exactly how we faced it in our media, which brainwashed people. They were afraid of dying a bad death. when you're hearing story after story after story, it convinces you that we're going to need euthanasia, and I'm afraid of having a bad death. And there was no other story but saying, oh, you can have excellent palliative care. That was not a story being seen in the media, no. So that's what the first thing happened. Secondly, things are now reversing, because there's been so many stories now in the media. So when the euthanasia lobby people come and say, oh, they're lying to you, it's not true. There's been, and I'm not just talking about, you know, conservative media, because that's not the case. We're talking about all the major media have been producing these stories of people who are poor, people with disabilities who can't get medical treatment. And it's starting to make people think, well, we've gone too far. Just before I came here, the Toronto Star, which is Canada's liberal newspaper, they're like the liberal newspaper, they have come out saying Canada's gone too far. So you're getting this backlash happening. The problem is obviously speaking, we need a government change in Canada.
Kevin, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The only thing I'd add is that Canada is the best way of us arguing here against assisted suicide and any kind of legalization. So despite the fact that there are many, many depressing stories, I think there's also a great deal of hope that we can take away from looking at the terrible example of Canada. I think the key thing is that it's a small group of people who put this through, and they put it through a population that is barely aware of it. And when the more and more people become aware of this, the more people will resist it, because you can see the horror story of Canada. So I think I'm quite hopeful about these kind of situations.
So I'll tell you a very quick story. So last year we were debating the issue of euthanasia for mental illness because the government was there for backtracking. They had promised to bring in euthanasia for mental illness for March of 2023, and they were getting such a backlash. It was so heavy, they decided we're going to delay it till March of 2024. The reason, of course, was they were taking so much political heat on it, they decided they wanted to turn down the temperature. But at the same time, this young man in Orillia, Ontario, he said, there was an article in the local paper, he was trying to convince people that we should have euthanasia for mental illness, and there was articles about him. He had been homeless for 8 years. That's very sad, okay? And he was saying he has no hope. I have no hope. I've been homeless for 8 years. I have no hope. He wanted euthanasia. And obviously, by delaying it, that delayed his opportunity to die, right? I met with Tyler, so I had lunch with Tyler. And Tyler was quite belligerent and everything, but he was nice enough. But I asked him, Tyler, why do you want a doctor to kill you? And he says, honestly, I feel I have no hope. He's not talking about his pain and suffering. Obviously he's gone through a lot of suffering. He's been homeless for 8 years. He's now changed his mind. He's writing a book. It's going to be coming out actually in the next couple of weeks. A bunch of us started helping him out. Someone gave him a place to live. He's going to go into rehab soon. He's had an alcohol problem for many, many years also, which addictions often lead to homelessness. Anyway, his life is turning around. But someone cared about him.
Yeah.
Someone cared about him. Then he had hope.
That's great. Question coming in here. Are there any stats or evidence regarding the impact upon the mental well-being, both short and long-term, for healthcare professionals who are involved in the act of MAID?
Well, there actually is some information, but there isn't any recent information. There was a study done in Oregon a while back. There is a study out of Belgium, I believe. It wasn't, but there isn't a lot of stats on this. And there needs to be significant data on this because there is clear factual evidence about people who are involved with euthanasia, who turn around, and it really affects them emotionally. So in Canada, there's been quite a few doctors who then agreed in the beginning to be part of this, and then who changed their mind and said no. So, and their reason is they felt really existentially affected by it. But nonetheless, it doesn't take a lot of doctors to say yes to get most of the deaths done. So if you look at the data in Canada, very few of the doctors do almost all of them, and then there's a few doctors who do some of them, okay? And so you can see the data, and you realize, and it shows you how many have done one or two, but how many have done a lot of them. I'll give you another fact about Canada. every major hospital in Canada has what they call a MAID team. So they've decided that because it's legal, you need to have access to it. So in order to create access, they created these teams in the hospital. They're the ones who do the act, right? They go from room to room, and if you have a very chronic condition or you have a terminal condition, they will ask you if you want MAID, okay? And then they will be the ones providing it. So you have then restricted it down to a small group of people who are actually doing almost all of the deaths. And then there's, as I say, a very a significant number that are doing just one or two.
Okay.
William, can I come in?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know of any hard data either, but I do know of a lot of stories. And I know of doctors, and it is primarily doctors so far around the world, who are involved in this, who describe not being able to sleep for days and days before either seeing somebody to discuss this or giving an injection or prescribing the drugs, but particularly giving the injection, because whatever you think about this, and if you prescribe somebody some drugs and they choose when to take it, at least they're choosing when to take the drugs. But if you're giving the injection, you're just doing it. You're just killing them. And they will die very quickly with an injection, much more quickly than they will with the oral drugs on average. But I also know of stories of, from Canada, surprise, surprise, of, and they're not stories, they're all over YouTube and places, go find them if you wish to, of people saying, well, the first 2 or 3 times I did this, it was a really big thing and I had to take a big deep breath, and then it just became what I do. It just became normal.
So we did have a story by Madeline Lee. She's a euthanasia, a doctor who's done quite a few euthanasia deaths in Toronto. And she's now saying, well, I realize I shouldn't have done that one and I shouldn't have done this one. That was probably a mistake. But, you know, it's funny to say that afterwards because now the person's dead. You know, I'm not saying that any of those deaths were any good. I'm just saying you start thinking, well, it's interesting now that you're reflecting on it. Yeah, that was probably not the right thing to do. But the other thing about it, there's quite a few doctors who are involved in it who actually seem to really enjoy it, meaning they seem to find great exhilaration by it. And that creates the other concern by me, which is the fact is there's always a group of humans who are somehow into killing. And if you give them a chance to do it, they'll do it. There is a large group of them, not too many actually, but there's a bunch of them. And a couple of them in particular have written books about it, their practice, and they seem to really acknowledge their exhilaration with it. So that concerns me also. That's not really human in my belief, but, you know, humans are funny.
Funny, peculiar, not funny, ha-ha.
Very funny, peculiar, yeah. We've got a couple of factual things which have been asked here, and it's really about sort of a process to where the situation is, where we're up to with the situation in Jersey. So there's one which says, how far are we from the assisted dying law being passed or considered to be passed as law in Jersey? Well, I think I can answer part of that insofar as there was as I explained in the history as to where we got up to, there was they asked ethicists to get involved, and so the report of that is now out. There was going to be a debate happening in the States Chamber, and that was going to be taking place before the end of this year, then it was going to go back to February, and then that's been pushed back to later on in 2024. But there is still, I think, Rachel, if you can clarify on this, I think it's that if they're going to bring it in, they were hoping to be able to have the debate and bring it in by the end of 25, wasn't it?
That's the plan within Jersey, because it has been voted in principle. But if you read the thing, it's subject to a workable way of doing this and appropriate safeguards. And also, very importantly, within the law, they've said that they don't think this should come in until there is adequate palliative care in Jersey. So I think, you know, as a psychiatrist, I don't think there is adequate palliative care for end-of-life dementia at the moment. We don't have beds for that. And we don't have 24/7 on-demand palliative care. And there's a new palliative care and end-of-life strategy that's been published by the government, which they've now got to look at funding and bringing in the resources and the ability to achieve this. So I think one of our hopes with this type of evening where we can get people understanding a little bit more about it is that, you know, we can delay this, and we can delay it for really good reasons, and that's what we really need to be pushing for, I think, in Jersey, to say we want better palliative care. We want these things to be looked at much more than we want the assisted dying legislation to come through.
Could I just say something here as well? That we have a couple of states members here I recognise this evening. Thank you for coming and listening. The invite went out to all states members, may I say. You can make a difference by talking to your states members about this issue. You can make appointments. There are so-called surgeries now, I think, is it, where you can go along. And that's what we'd ask you to do, and share your concerns. Please, people wrote in, and Rachel had shared this last week, with the Freedom of Information in the public consultation report. There was a factor of 5 to 1 against the introduction of assisted dying in Jersey, in that public consultation report. That was not publicised, but that is the reality. And that sent a message. It's not this 85% are for, 5 to 1 are against. Okay, so you can make a difference and send a message. Coming here tonight, you've made a difference. So coming to you.
I want to make one little comment about Canada, because some of you say, well, we're in Jersey, this isn't Canada, and that's a good comment. But you know, in Canada, in 2015, we were talking about what was going on in the Netherlands and Belgium, because there's a lot of stories of the Netherlands and Belgium about these deaths, people with autism, etc. Lots of stories that are quite chilling, what was happening in the Netherlands and Belgium. And we were told over and over again, but we're not the Netherlands or Belgium, we're Canada. This won't happen here. That was exactly what we were told over and over and over again. So I'm telling you, the argument that it's not going to happen in Jersey, or it's not going to happen in Scotland, or it's not going to happen in the UK because we're not Canada, guess what? I agree you're not Canada, but we were told the same thing. Once you legalize it, it's fair game to open it further. The other thing about it is you should be, you know, I'm not proud of my own country in any way because of what we're doing. I like our coffee, you know, I like our hockey, but I mean, I'm not proud of our country for what we're doing, but you should be getting these stories, and they do come out. You notice they're all in regular news stories, so it's not like Alex Schadenberg's writing some story and you say, oh, well, it's him again. No, it's not that at all. And most of the people writing these stories are actually not against assisted dying. They're just reporters writing a story that seems quite shocking, and we have to use them. Because the fact of it is it will happen here if you legalize. It may not happen tomorrow that way, or the next day, or maybe not in 5 years, but certainly soon down the line it will get there too, because it's inevitable once you legalize. As I say, really, there is only one line in the sand. You can't create new lines. It doesn't work that way, because everything else, every new line is based on a discriminatory point of view. We're not going to allow it for this person. We think we have a good reason, but once killing is okay, now your good reason is gone for saying no to expanding it.
Yeah. I have got another question here, which John, I don't know whether has got X-ray vision, but it came over that you've already answered part of it, because it was, are Alex and Kevin like to be speaking to politicians? Well, I can say again that they did meet with a couple earlier on today, and there are some in the audience, so that's a good thing. But I think the other point to add to it is that they were interviewed, so there is going to be footage, which again we will circulate in the same way that we did an interview with Leonie when she came across, and that was circulated and is out and about there. You can find it on YouTube. If you've got any questions about it, you can come back to any one of us, and we'll point you in the right direction if you want to see any of the recordings we've done. So there are powerful messages that go out there. And with regard to the state's members, we would encourage you, and I think John will absolutely support me on this, we'd encourage you to talk to your deputies, talk to your constables, and go and raise your concerns, air your concerns. And it's by talking about raising awareness, they're the people ultimately, when it comes down to taking the vote, they are the people who make the decision. It's not down to any of us in this room, it's down to the people, the sitting states members. So I think that's quite an important one. There's a gentleman down here who'd like to ask a question. If we could pass the microphone, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to go back to the end-of-life and palliative care strategy that's been produced by the government in partnership with the hospice. And just perhaps to get a comment from the panel, the strategy was very short on how this is going to be financed, and that was a red flag to me, really, because if it's going to be private sector funding, that's one thing. If you're going into partnership with government and palliative care and funding is going to be provided, I know they do some already, I'm just a little concerned about the leverage of that if a government is then going to be passing an assisted dying law. And I don't know whether the panel would just like to comment on the sort of ethics of that, really, or just how they think that might operate.
I think the whole sort of, I think euthanasia and assisted dying being within healthcare is just completely problematic, because we've heard really clearly from Carol about what's happening around the world, about how hospices are being asked to be part of this, and it so isn't healthcare. I really hope that our government here don't use that as leverage. And you're really right that there isn't funding attached, and bearing in mind that we're 26 million in debt in the health sector at the moment, and we're all being asked to try and save money right, left and centre. I don't know where the funding is going to come from for the palliative care strategy, but what we have to hang on to is that the law that has been proposed says that assisted dying must not come until the palliative care provision is better in Jersey, and that is a real leverage that we have there, and we need to be asking them to find the money, and I don't know what the plan is. We hope more detail will come out.
I'm not party to the detail, but I know there's a lot of discussion, as you would expect, about funding and expansion of service, which in effect would make palliative and end-of-life care available to anybody and everybody who might need or want it. So it's a complicated thing, and it's not for me to be talking about the details of it. But care costs money, and I absolutely believe put the care right, and then if you find an unmet need and you think there's a need for euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, look at it again if you have to. But for goodness sake, please get the care right first. And it's not just palliative care. It's palliative care, it's mental health care, it's community care, it's social care. I could go on, but I'm sure you could work those gaps out too, because I don't live on Jersey. And there are gaps in Southampton too. I'm not picking on Jersey.
That's great. There's one here saying, we hear about in the press about Jersey's medical staff recruitment problem, and what do the panel think that the impact of MAID or an equivalent, how would that affect the ability of Jersey to be able to attract and also to retain staff or medical professionals?
Just one observation. I was on the Isle of Man a couple of weeks ago, and a third of their medical staff are threatening to quit if assisted dying goes through there. So I suspect you'll have a very similar situation.
I think that's the answer.
So let me tell you from Canada, your problem is that palliative care is a prime example of what we're talking about. Providing proper end-of-life care requires a certain type of experience. Yes, you learn it, but there's also an experience nature to it. And in Canada, someone who I know quite well was a full-time palliative care doc in Mississauga, completely committed to it, well trained in it, lots of experience. And we legalized euthanasia, and he was told, you're going to have to do an effective referral. So he had, by the time he had 3 cases of requests that he refused to refer, of course, he wasn't going to refer somebody if he wasn't going to kill them himself, he wasn't going to refer them to a killer. He realized he was in a bad place for himself, so he left palliative care. Now he runs a pain clinic in Brampton. In November, I was at a Christmas party, and there was a local doctor who was a good friend of mine, and he was at the Christmas party, and he said, Alex, did you hear the news? And I said, no, what's the news? He says, oh, my medical license has now been approved in Ohio. He says, I'm not going to do euthanasia. I'm not going to refer for it. I was getting into a lot of pressure. Therefore, I've now been approved in Ohio. I'm leaving. He's now a physician in Ohio. So we lost him. So, you know, this is a problem. It's a serious problem.
Somebody.
Yeah, okay, down in the front here.
Hi, I work in healthcare, and I just wanted to make an observation about, you talked about brainwashing earlier, and I know that we had 2 evenings where healthcare staff were to go along and kind of debate all of these issues, and I went to one of those evenings, and I think there was myself and one other person that was a clinician that was there. There were a couple of people who were relatives of someone. But they just, and I think the other night was pretty much the same. So there really wasn't an appetite for it that I could see within healthcare professionals. And following on from that, we received a questionnaire that we all were invited to, you know, submit answers to. And the questions were really pure brainwashing, because it was, you know, the questions were things like, this is the length of time that we think that, you know, people should be allowed to think about, you know, when they should die. What do you think? Should we extend it to this, this, or this? But there was absolutely no options whatsoever for anyone to say, hang on, we don't agree with it. You know, I find that really concerning.
That's been the case in public consultation as well. The last public consultation was very much like that as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I would say is the ethics review that's come out this week has said that one of the positive things within it is it has said that they would want to seek more views about what healthcare professionals think. And so I think there is a space for us to speak into that, and that's going to be really important.
I think one has to ask the question why that wasn't done in the first place. Having said that, in Canada, I think, is it still 2% of doctors
it's around,
actually engage in euthanasia and prescribing the drugs? Just going back to how you opened your point, I think all I can say is this is a very complex and emotive issue, and I think it's quite hard to raise your head above the parapet sometimes, especially possibly in a small community. That's my view. I haven't garnered that from anybody at the hospice or anywhere else, but it's what I've seen elsewhere, and I think that's a really real phenomenon.
That's great. There's one here which I know some of the answers to, but I think it's probably better that our panel answer it. It says, you spoke of drugs used to end a person's life. Is it a dose of morphine? The answer to that I know is no. How do they end life, and are there complications? So it was in one of the presentations about some of the drugs that are used, but I think maybe the point to pick out on this is about the complications. And who would like to pick up on that?
Yeah, the complication, and okay, so this depends what you're looking at. So if you're looking at physician-assisted suicide, the whole point is that people are empowered to take the drugs away and take them when they wish. And in Oregon, where there's the most experience in the world, that's done not necessarily with any healthcare professional or anybody there. So there's no data gathering. And in the Oregon data, they've had physician-assisted suicide for just about 25 years. And in their data sets, there's as much data missing about all sorts of things as there is data there. So there's not a lot of information. But what there is increasing evidence about how people die, and that the deaths are not necessarily fast, especially with the oral drugs, and not necessarily pain-free, and complication rates of at least 10% are being talked about. And one of the complications is that you might not die. You will die with euthanasia, because that includes paralyzing your diaphragm so you can't breathe. And that is how you die. So that is how you die of euthanasia. And the doses of the drugs are industrial. They're massive. I can't remember the exact numbers right now, and it probably doesn't matter this evening, but they are massive doses. So phenobarbital in ginormous doses, opioids, 5 grams of morphine. 5 grams of morphine? You know, we think someone's on quite a lot if they're on 50 or 100 milligrams twice a day, you know. Diazepam in massive doses. And this is a cocktail. It's not one drug. These are cocktails of 4 or 5 different drugs. Bizarrely, amitriptyline and other drugs that some of you may be aware of. So that they are, and there's no research. These are not researched formulae or cocktails. They are, the euthanasia kills by giving you a whacking dose so you can't breathe anymore, so you're going to die. And the oral drugs kill you by hitting all of your body massively, your heart, your brain, all sorts of things that keep you alive. It's not researched, and the only thing that drives, and in Oregon, there have been 4 changes of the oral regime over the last 7 years. The one thing that's driving that is that people don't die quickly enough.
And we had an awful, there was a shocking sort of statement, wasn't there? It was something that we were involved in earlier this week where we were told there was more research on thalidomide than there has been on these drugs being used for assisted dying.
Right, I'm going to take one more question for the floor. I have got some more questions down here, and apologies, I'm conscious of the fact that time's marching on. It's getting towards 9:45, and some people have started to leave. So I'm going to take one more question from the floor here. Then what I also, with the questions I've got, which come through on the deck, I will put these to the panel, and we'll get some answers out, and I will make sure they get published through onto the website, certainly of the Jersey Dying Well Group website. I will get these questions answered and put up to there.
So I have a few pamphlets there if anybody wants them.
There are pamphlets. So can we take one more question from the floor here, and then I'm going to just bring it to... Sorry. Okay. Okay, 1 second. I'll just hang on a second. I'm going to get a microphone because not everybody will be able to hear you.
Could I just clarify, when I said the 5-1, I should have said of written submissions.
Right.
Okay.
So we'll take one from the lady there, and then the one from the gentleman down here as well.
I'm a Jersey person. I left the island beginning of this year. I actually moved to the Isle of Man. So I know what's going on over there as well. I was a jury member. The paper came through my letterbox, and I was going through a very difficult time. Family member dying. Anyway, to cut a long story short, on the 11th hour I applied and I was accepted. Within half an hour of the first meeting that we had, it was very clear to me that there was a majority who had come onto the jury with one intention, and that was to pass this law. So be under no illusion whatsoever. I used to do debates in the sixth form at school, and I'm absolutely shocked and appalled how it's roller coasted. The evidence was excellent on both sides, but it was overwhelming not to pass this law. But when you've made up your mind that you're going to do something, I think there's actually, scientific evidence that it's very difficult then to dissuade someone. I carry a heavy burden because I was distraught and shocked at, and I'm only talking about a small percentage, I can only describe it as coldness, really. They even wanted to include children. They even wanted to include children. Definitely depressed people. I think I completely lost it over the children part. And for that reason, they decided to withhold it. But they do want to push it further down the line, so don't be under any illusion. There's states members here. I'm very disappointed with you, not maybe you personally, whoever's here. I wrote a letter to every single states member after the jury. I didn't get a single reply. I didn't even get an acknowledgement. But my letter did go to Westminster. When I spoke to, all of this happened during COVID, so this was also made it very difficult. But when I was, anyone who thinks there's safeguarding measures over here, they're not. In my experience, they were zero. And my loved one is dead because of the Capacity 2018 law. So, and you want to bring in something like this. The naivety is beggars belief. What I would say is, I spoke to the local politician and I said, you know, you didn't even have the decency to acknowledge my letter. And this was a while later. And he said, well, how did you send it? And I said, I sent it. I phoned up the State's office and they told me the email to use and it would be sent to all of you. And he said, oh, you didn't use that, it doesn't work. And they want to pass a law deciding who lives and who dies.
Thank you.
What I would say to everyone, there are States members who are hell-bent on passing this law. There are a group of people who are hell-bent on passing this law. It is up to the individuals, the people who have a chance to change this. All the evidence is there. Do your research. We've had excellent talks this evening. Other things that are available to you. Do not pass this law because there will be blood on whoever there will be. I'm sorry, I'm saying it as it is.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just one final question from the gentleman here, please.
Thank you. It's not really a question, it's more of a point. Our daughter was born with a unique genetic condition, which meant that she was severely disabled. The doctors couldn't give us any prognosis or any life expectancy. We had 25 fabulous years with her. But every time she went into hospital, even though we said no to DNR, do not resuscitate, we were pressured every single time to put DNR onto her notes. My wife was woken up at 3 o'clock one morning because the doctor said, oh, you haven't got DNR on the notes, and I see your daughter's in a wheelchair. So she must be disabled, and she can't have quality of life. So my concern was always, if we put DNR on her notes, would her life have been ended? And what will happen in the future? We're saying people with only with capacity, but you're a 25-year-old in a wheelchair, cannot talk, cannot walk, cannot feed herself. Somebody will say, she's got no quality of life, without knowing her quality of life. And I know there's a lot of people in the room here who knew my daughter Rachel, and they would tell you she had a great quality of life.
Thank you. So, in bringing things to a conclusion, I'm going to go back to a comment that Carol actually said earlier on, and that was about the arguments about people who answer a survey. And a lot of the people who answer the surveys, they think they already know what they're talking about. And probably the majority of the people in this room, if not everybody, has come along because you've got a vested interest and you care, and you want to hear the stories, and you don't want to see a change in the law. As I said to you earlier on, the only way that that law will change or not change is down to the people who actually make the vote. So if you care enough, then please do contact your local politicians and express your concerns. Talk to friends, relatives, colleagues at work, and articulate some of the powerful messages, really powerful messages you've heard tonight. This evening has been put together in conjunction between Jersey Dying Well Group and our Duty of Care Jersey. They both have websites. There's plenty of information on it. If you need to refer to factual information, you can go and refer to those websites. And certainly on the Jersey Dying World group, there is a bit of a blog. There are stories we've put on there. So some of the stories tonight that we're told are already on there. And we put some bits and pieces onto that website. If you want to have up-to-date stories that you can then go and tell to your colleagues, friends, families, relatives, and so on and so forth. But I think I'd like to thank, firstly, very much everybody who's spoken tonight, the people who've asked the questions. I'd also like to thank the Freedom Centre, who've been wonderful. It's an amazing venue, this, for putting on an event like this. And so thank you very much to the guys behind the desk as well. So the other point is about both Jersey Dying World Group and our duty of care. They do have websites. There's a social media channels that you can follow through Facebook, certainly, and Twitter. Again, there's messages coming out there. I mean, Kevin tweets, other people tweet, and we pick up and we retweet some of that. So if you want to hear more up-to-date things as they happen, by all means, follow those channels. But actually, all of the information that you've heard tonight, all of the information that we're going to retweet, it's all readily available. You've just got to go onto the internet, and there are so many stories out there. Go onto YouTube, you'll see other interviews and bits and pieces. There are so many stories if you need other facts and figures to support your arguments when you express your concerns to the politicians. But it is the politicians who are going to make that decision. So, in conclusion, thank you everybody for coming along tonight. I know it's not particularly pleasant out there, but it's been wonderful to see so many of you here. And if you'd like to all put your hands again, and thank you very much to the speakers. Finally, as Alex said, there are some leaflets down here. If you'd like to take some more information away, Alex has brought some information over, and you're welcome to take any of those. Thank you very much, and good evening.